Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been so sick you could barely get out of bed and still worried more about work than yourself? Have you ever feared that the one day you finally put your health first might be the exact day everything changes without you? If you've ever experienced workplace injustice like that, or even wondered how quickly loyalty can be forgotten, you're not alone. These workplace injustice stories happen more often than people admit, and they tend to hit when people are at their most vulnerable. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss powerful workplace injustice stories like this one, because every story shared here comes from real moments that leave lasting marks. In 14 years, I had never called in sick. Not once. I showed up through headaches, exhaustion, and days when I probably should have stayed home. I built my reputation at the finance firm on being reliable, steady, and always present. People depended on me, and I took pride in that. So the morning I finally reached for my phone and typed that message, it felt almost unnatural. I'm not feeling well today. I need to take a sick day. I stared at the screen for a moment before sending it. Even after 14 years, I still felt like I was doing something wrong by not being there. My manager replied a few minutes later. Short. Professional. Take care. Feel better soon. That was it. I put my phone down and tried to rest, thinking the day would pass quietly. A few hours later, it rang. I assumed it was someone checking in. Maybe a question about a file. Maybe someone needing help finding something I usually handled. Instead, HR's name flashed across the screen. That alone made my stomach drop. I answered, still groggy, my voice weak. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. They told me my role was being terminated effective immediately due to restructuring. 14 years. Gone. And the speed of it all made one thing painfully clear. This wasn't a decision they made that morning. I stayed on the edge of the bed long after the call ended, the phone still in my hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. 14 years. Gone in less than 3 minutes. No warning. No meeting. No conversation. Just a calm voice and a decision that sounded like it had already been signed, sealed, and filed away. The word restructuring kept echoing in my head. It didn't make sense. Decisions like that took time. Planning. Meetings. Paperwork. You didn't just wake up one morning and suddenly eliminate someone who had been part of the firm for over a decade. Not unless the decision had already been made long before that phone call. I opened my email slowly, my hands still unsteady, and there it was. The termination notice. It had been sent before HR even called me. I stared at the timestamp, my heart starting to beat faster. The email had gone out almost an hour earlier, which meant the paperwork was already prepared. The decision already finalized. The call wasn't to discuss anything. It was just to inform me. I leaned back against the pillow, a cold realization settling in. Calling in sick hadn't caused this. It had just triggered it. My phone buzzed suddenly, pulling me out of my thoughts. A message from a coworker. Hey, are you off today? I can't find the latest review files you were working on. I stared at the screen, unsure how to answer. Because the truth was, I didn't have access anymore. I read the message again, the words feeling heavier the second time. Hey, are you off today? I can't find the latest review files you were working on. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. I wasn't ready to explain. I wasn't even sure I fully understood what had just happened myself. But after 14 years of working closely with the same people, silence felt wrong. I'm homesick, I typed. Then after a pause, I added, HR called this morning. I was terminated. The typing dots appeared almost instantly. Then disappeared. Then came back again. What? Are you serious? I swallowed slowly. Yeah. A long pause followed. Wait. I thought you were just out for the day, she wrote. They said your responsibilities were being reassigned. My chest tightened. Reassigned. Since when? I asked. There was another delay before her reply came through. I'm not sure. I just know someone was already handling your morning tasks when I logged in. I sat very still, staring at the message. Already handling my tasks. That meant someone stepped in the moment I wasn't there. Not later in the day. Not after a meeting. Immediately. A slow, unsettling thought began to form. This didn't feel like a sudden decision. It felt like something they had already prepared for. And the day I called in sick was just the day they finally acted. I sat there staring at the message, trying to process what she had just said. Someone was already handling my tasks. Not stepping in later. Not scrambling to cover for me. Already handling them. That meant the transition had been planned. I typed carefully. Who's covering? There was a short pause. I think it's Daniel from the next team over. He logged into your workflow this morning. Daniel. I frowned, searching my memory. He'd been around more often lately. Asking questions. Sitting beside me during certain reviews. I thought he was just trying to understand how our processes connected. I even walked him through a few things over the past couple of weeks. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now, it felt different. You've been training him, right? She added. I stared at the screen. Training. That word hit harder than anything else. I had shown him how I tracked changes, how I compared reports, how I caught small inconsistencies before approvals went through. I thought I was helping a colleague learn. I didn't realize I might have been teaching someone how to replace me. Another message came through. He already knew where everything was this morning. Like he'd been preparing. I leaned back slowly, a cold heaviness settling in my chest. This didn't start when I called in sick. It started weeks ago. I set the phone down beside me, my mind racing through every recent interaction. Daniel had been around more often, yes. But so had my manager. Stopping by to ask questions. Sitting in during reviews. Watching more closely than usual. At the time, I thought they were just being thorough. Now it felt like observation. My phone buzzed again. Are you okay? She asked. This all feels strange. I didn't answer right away. Because the more I thought about it, the more the timeline didn't add up. I called in sick that morning. Within hours, I was fired. My access was cut. My tasks were reassigned. And someone already knew exactly how to step into my role. That kind of shift didn't happen in a few hours. It took planning. Did Daniel start covering my work after I called in? I typed. Her reply came back quickly. No, he was already in your systems first thing this morning. My stomach dropped. First thing in the morning. Before HR even called me. Before I knew I was losing my job. Another message followed. Honestly, it looked like he knew what to expect. I stared at the screen, the weight of that sentence sinking in. Because it meant something had been set in motion long before I stayed home that day. I sat in silence, letting that last message replay in my head. He was already in your systems first thing this morning. That meant everything was lined up before HR even called me. Before I understood what was happening. Before I could ask a single question. I opened my laptop slowly, almost out of instinct, and tried to log into my work account. Access denied. I tried again, thinking maybe I typed something wrong. Same result. My access had been cut off completely. I stared at the screen, the finality of it hitting me harder than the phone call had. 14 years of files, reports, processes, and connections, all gone with a single click. No transition period. No time to hand anything over. Just locked out. My phone buzzed again. They just announced Daniel is covering your role temporarily, my coworker wrote. Temporarily. That word felt hollow. How does he know everything already? I asked. There was a pause before she replied. He's been asking a lot of questions lately. I thought he was just learning how things worked. I closed my eyes slowly. So it wasn't just me. He'd been studying everything. Watching. Learning. And the moment I wasn't there, he stepped right in. I leaned back against the headboard, exhaustion pressing into me, but my mind wouldn't slow down. The more I thought about the last few weeks, the more details started to surface. Daniel asking about my review process. My manager stopping by to observe how I tracked changes. Leadership suddenly interested in understanding how certain reports connected. At the time, I assumed they were trying to improve efficiency. Now it felt like documentation. They weren't just learning how things worked. They were learning how to run it without me. My phone buzzed again. Things feel tense here, my coworker wrote. Everyone's moving fast today. I frowned slightly. Fast how? I asked. Another pause. Leadership wants that large approval finalized today. The one you were reviewing. My chest tightened instantly. I knew exactly which one she meant. The file I paused. The one I refused to approve until I finished checking the numbers. They're pushing it through? I asked. A few seconds passed. Then her reply came. Yeah, it sounds like they don't want any delays anymore. I stared at the message, a cold realization settling deep in my chest. The moment I was gone, so was the hesitation. 8. I sat there staring at the message, my mind immediately jumping back to the last time I opened that file. I remembered the numbers clearly. They weren't wildly off, not enough to raise alarms on their own. But they didn't line up with the earlier projections either. Something about them made me stop. That was why I paused. I never accused anyone. I never raised a formal concern. I just told my manager I needed more time before approving anything. I wanted to compare versions. Double-check the details. Make sure I understood what I was looking at. Now they were pushing it through without that pause. My phone buzzed again. They're saying it needs to be finalized today, my coworker wrote. Leadership doesn't want it sitting anymore. I felt a tightness settle in my chest. Who's approving it? I asked. There was a short delay. Daniel's handling it now. Of course he was. The same person who had been watching my process for weeks. The same person who stepped into my systems the moment I wasn't there. I leaned my head back against the wall, a heavy realization forming. The one thing slowing that approval down was me. And the day I called in sick was the first day they could move forward without resistance. I picked up my notebook from the side table, flipping to the pages from the week before. I had written down the totals I saw when I first noticed the differences. Just for myself. Dates. Figures. Small notes in the margins. I found the page and stared at the circled numbers. I remembered that night clearly. The office was almost empty. I stayed late, comparing one version to another, trying to understand why the totals kept shifting slightly. I never found a clear explanation. That's why I refused to sign off. My phone buzzed again. It just got approved, my coworker wrote. I felt my stomach drop. Already? I typed. Yeah. It moved fast once Daniel took over. I stared at the screen, the weight of that sentence settling deep. Weeks of hesitation. Careful checking. And now it was done in a single day. Another message came through. People are saying the projections are higher than expected now. I looked back down at the numbers I had written. Higher. That was exactly what I had noticed too. I ran my finger over the page, tracing the totals. Because the truth was, I never got the chance to figure out why they changed. I stared at the circled numbers, my mind replaying that late night at the office. I had opened the report expecting a routine review, but the totals were slightly higher than I remembered from earlier versions. Not dramatically. Just enough to make me pause and compare. That was always my process. I never signed off until everything lined up. And that night, something didn't. I remembered checking an older file, then another, trying to understand what had shifted. I never found a clear explanation. That was why I stopped. That was why I told my manager I needed more time. Now, lying at home, fired, I wondered what happened after I stepped away. My phone buzzed again. People are rechecking the projections, my coworker wrote. They're trying to understand how the numbers changed so fast. I felt a slow chill move through me. Do they know the earlier totals? I asked. Another pause. Not really. They're just looking at the latest version. I looked down at my notebook again. The earlier totals were right there, written in my handwriting. The only clear record of what I saw before everything shifted. Another message came through. They're asking if anyone remembers when the changes started. I stared at the date I had written beside the circled numbers. Because I remembered exactly when I first noticed something didn't feel right. I leaned back slowly, letting the timeline piece itself together in my mind. I noticed the difference. I paused the approval. I asked for more time. Then I got sick. And the moment I wasn't there, everything moved faster. My phone buzzed again. They're trying to figure out why the process slowed down last week, she wrote. I let out a quiet breath. I slowed it down, I typed. I didn't feel comfortable approving it yet. There was a long pause before her reply came. That makes sense. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? Another message appeared. Once you were gone, it moved really fast. Like they didn't want any delays. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Of course it moved fast. I had been the one asking questions, the one comparing versions, the one making sure things lined up before anything was finalized. Without me there, no one paused. Another message came through. They're trying to retrace what you were checking before you called in sick. I looked down at my notebook again, the circled numbers staring back at me. Because the truth was, I was still trying to understand it myself when everything stopped. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the notebook in my lap. For years, writing things down had been second nature. Dates, totals, small differences between versions. It helped me keep track of patterns that weren't always obvious on the surface. At the time, it was just a habit. Now it felt like the only solid record of what I had seen before everything changed. My phone buzzed again. They're reviewing the approval again, my coworker wrote. Something isn't lining up the way they expected. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. Like what? I asked. There was a pause. They're saying the projections are higher than what was originally discussed. I looked down at my notes, comparing the earlier totals I had written with what I remembered seeing last. That was exactly what caught my attention in the first place. The numbers were creeping upward without a clear explanation. I noticed that too, I typed. That's why I paused. Another pause. Do you remember when you first saw the difference? She asked. I glanced at the date written beside the circled totals. I marked it down, I replied. 3 days before I called in sick. A few moments later, her next message came through. That's earlier than most people realized. I sat quietly, letting that sink in. Because it meant the change didn't happen suddenly. It had already started while I was still there. I flipped through a few more pages, retracing the sequence of that week. Each day had small notes beside it. Adjustments. Comparisons. Questions I meant to follow up on. I could almost picture myself sitting at my desk, staying late, checking one version after another, while the office slowly emptied. I remembered the pressure too. My manager stopping by more often than usual, asking if I was close to finishing, reminding me that leadership wanted the approval completed soon. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was persistent. I never rushed. That was the one rule I stuck to. No matter how tight the deadline was, I double-checked everything before signing off. My phone buzzed again. They're asking around about your process, she wrote. How you tracked the changes. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? They're trying to figure out how you noticed the differences before anyone else. I looked down at the notebook again. I just compared versions, I replied. I wrote down the totals so I could track them over time. A pause. Then, they're saying they don't have a clear record of the earlier numbers anymore. I felt a cold heaviness settle in my chest. Because the earlier totals were only written here. I stared at the page in silence, tracing the numbers with my finger as if they might suddenly explain everything on their own. I had written them down out of habit, nothing more. I never imagined they would become important. They were just part of my routine, a way to stay organized, to make sure I didn't miss anything. Now they felt like the only proof of what I had seen. My phone buzzed again. They're trying to find older versions of the report, my coworker wrote. But the system only shows the latest totals. I frowned. That's why I always wrote them down, I typed back. Once they update, the earlier ones can be hard to trace. There was a pause before she replied. Yeah, people are realizing that now. I leaned back slowly, letting that sink in. For years, I had quietly filled that gap. I tracked changes no one else thought to track. I caught differences before they became problems. And I never made a big deal about it. I just did it. Another message came through. They're trying to understand when the first shift started. I looked down at the date written beside the circled totals. I remembered that day clearly. That was the first time I felt something didn't add up. I had planned to follow up. I just never got the chance. I closed the notebook gently and set it beside me, exhaustion creeping in, but my mind refused to settle. The more I thought about the last few weeks, the clearer the pattern became. The pressure, the urgency, the constant reminders to move faster. And the moment I slowed things down, I became a problem. My phone buzzed again. They're asking who had final responsibility for verifying the numbers, she wrote. I didn't answer right away, because I already knew the truth. That had always been me. Not because of my title. Not because anyone officially assigned it that way. It just happened over time. I was the one who double-checked everything. The one who compared reports. The one who paused when something didn't feel right. And this time, I didn't sign off. They're saying the process suddenly sped up after you left, she added. I swallowed slowly. Of course it did. I had been the one slowing it down. The one asking for time. The one making sure everything lined up. Without me there, nothing stood in the way anymore. And for the first time, a thought settled heavily in my chest. Maybe calling in sick didn't cost me my job. Maybe it just gave them the chance they were already waiting for. The messages slowed down after that. For a few hours, my phone stayed quiet, and the silence felt strange. For the first time since that morning, there were no questions, no updates, no small pieces of information trickling in from the office. I tried to rest, but my mind wouldn't let me. I kept thinking about the last conversation I had with my manager before everything happened. He had stopped by my desk, standing just behind me while I compared the reports. Are we close? He had asked. I remember shaking my head. I told him I needed more time. That something didn't feel right yet. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and said, okay, just don't let it sit too long. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Now, looking back, it felt different. My phone buzzed again. Things are tense here, my coworker wrote. Leadership keeps asking when the approval was last reviewed. I sat up slightly. They don't know. I asked. A pause. Not exactly. Everyone thought it was already cleared before you were out. I closed my eyes for a moment. They thought I had finished. They thought the numbers were safe. And when I suddenly wasn't there to confirm anything, they just moved forward. I picked up the notebook again, flipping back to the first page where I had written down the totals that caught my attention. The date was clear. The numbers were circled twice. I remembered that night vividly, the quiet office, the glow of my screen, the nagging feeling that something didn't add up. I had trusted that feeling. My phone buzzed again. They're asking if you told anyone what you noticed, she wrote. I thought back carefully. I hadn't filed a report. I hadn't escalated it. I had only told my manager I needed more time to review everything properly. I didn't want to raise concerns until I was sure. I didn't get that far, I typed. I was still comparing versions. Another pause. Then, they're trying to figure out if the numbers changed after your last review. My chest tightened slightly, because I remembered something small. The morning I called in sick, before I left my laptop on the desk, I had opened the file one more time. And the totals looked slightly different again. I hadn't had time to compare them. I had just closed the file and told myself I'd look at it later. But later never came. I stared at the notebook, the memory becoming sharper the more I focused on it. That morning had felt rushed. I wasn't feeling well, but I still opened my laptop out of habit. I always checked things one last time before stepping away, even if it was just for a day. I remembered opening the file quickly, scanning the totals, and feeling that same quiet hesitation again. They looked different. Not dramatically. Just enough to make me pause. I told myself I would compare it properly when I felt better. I closed the file, sent the message that I was calling in sick, and went to lie down. I never touched it again. My phone buzzed. Do you remember how they changed? My coworker asked. I thought about it carefully. I didn't compare them properly, I typed. I just noticed they looked higher than what I had written down the night before. There was a pause. Then, that might be important. I felt a slow chill run through me, because the last version I saw was the one I never finished checking. And that was the same version they rushed to approve. I set the notebook down, my thoughts racing faster now. The more I replayed that morning, the clearer the sequence became. I saw the new totals. I hesitated. I planned to compare them later. Then I called in sick. A few hours later, I was fired. And by the end of the day, the approval was finalized. My phone buzzed again. They're rechecking projections again, she wrote. Something doesn't match what they expected. I felt my chest tighten. What do you mean? I asked. Another pause. They're saying the numbers don't line up with earlier estimates. They're trying to figure out when the first shift happened. I looked down at the date in my notebook again. I knew exactly when I first saw the difference. And it was days before everything sped up. They keep asking when you last reviewed it, she added. I swallowed slowly. Because the truth was, I was the last person who hesitated before it was approved. The last person who stopped and asked if something felt off. And the moment I wasn't there, no one stopped to ask. I stared at the last message, the words sitting heavily in my chest. The last person who hesitated. The last person who paused. I had never thought of it that way before, but the more I replayed everything, the more it felt true. For years, I had been the quiet checkpoint in the process. I compared numbers. I tracked small changes. I slowed things down just enough to make sure nothing slipped through. This time, I never finished. My phone buzzed again. "They're asking if you remember the earlier projections," she wrote. "The ones from before last week." I picked up the notebook and flipped back through the pages, stopping at the first set of totals I had written down. I could almost see the reports in front of me again, the numbers clean and steady before they started creeping upward. "I wrote them down," I replied. "From the first version I checked." A pause. "Then, they can't find those in the system anymore." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "They only see the latest figures. No one seems to know when the earlier numbers changed." I looked down at my handwriting again. The earlier totals were right there. Clear. Dated. Which meant the only record of what those numbers looked like before everything shifted was sitting in my lap. I leaned back slowly, the realization settling in deeper with every passing second. If the system only showed the most recent version, then the earlier numbers might have been overwritten. Updated. Buried beneath revisions no one was tracking closely. That was why I always wrote them down. Not because I expected anything to go wrong. Just because I trusted patterns more than memory. My phone buzzed again. "They're trying to figure out why the projections are higher now," she wrote. "They're asking when the first difference appeared." I glanced at the notebook again, my eyes landing on the circled date. I noticed the first change 3 days before I called in sick, I typed. There was a longer pause this time. 3 days, she replied. "That's earlier than most people thought." I swallowed slowly. "That's why I didn't approve it," I said. I wanted to understand what caused it. Another pause. Then, "They're starting to ask why the process moved so fast after you were gone." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Because I already knew the answer. The only thing slowing it down had been me. I set the phone down for a moment, letting everything settle in. For years, I had been part of that process without ever thinking too deeply about my place in it. I reviewed, compared, checked, and signed off when everything made sense. It was routine, quiet, expected. But now, hearing how fast things moved after I was gone, I started to see it differently. My hesitation had always slowed things down just enough for people to double-check. I didn't stop progress. I just made sure it was steady. Without me there, nothing slowed it down. My phone buzzed again. "They're asking about your process again," my coworker wrote. "How you track changes." I frowned slightly. "Why?" I asked. A pause. "They're trying to figure out how you notice the differences before anyone else." I looked down at the notebook in my hands. I compared versions, I typed. I wrote down the totals every time I reviewed something major. Another pause. Then, "They're saying no one else was doing that." A strange feeling settled in my chest. For 14 years, I had quietly filled that gap. No one asked. No one noticed. I just made sure things made sense before anything moved forward. And the moment I wasn't there anymore, that entire layer of caution disappeared. I sat there in silence, staring at the circled numbers again. For the first time, I began to understand something I had never fully seen before. I hadn't just been doing my job. I had been the final checkpoint. The last person who slowed things down long enough to catch small changes before they became something bigger. My phone buzzed again. "They're going back through older reports," she wrote, "trying to see if the projections were always this high." I felt a slow chill run through me. "Were they?" I asked. Another pause. "Not from what people remember." I ran my fingers over the notebook page again. Because I knew what the earlier totals looked like. I had written them down. "They keep asking when the first difference appeared," she added. I glanced at the date beside the circled numbers. 3 days before I called in sick, I typed again. A long pause followed. Then her next message came through. "They're starting to realize that's when everything began shifting." I leaned back slowly, the weight of that realization settling in. because that meant something had already been changing. Long before I ever stayed home that day, I set the notebook down beside me, staring at the wall as everything finally began to make sense in a way I hadn't allowed myself to see before. For days, I had been focused on the shock of being fired. The anger. The confusion. The hurt of losing 14 years in a single phone call. But now the timeline felt clearer. Weeks before I called in sick, someone had already been learning my processes, watching how I worked, asking questions I thought were harmless. I believed I was helping a colleague understand the workflow better. In reality, I might have been training the person who would step into my role. My phone buzzed again. "They're still trying to trace when the projections first started changing," my coworker wrote. "Everyone's confused about why no one caught it earlier." I let out a slow breath. I knew why. Because the only person who was slowing down the process long enough to notice those small shifts was me. And the moment I was gone, the hesitation disappeared. Another message followed. "Honestly, it feels like they wanted that approval done quickly," she added. I stared at the screen, the thought forming slowly. Maybe calling in sick didn't make me expendable. Maybe it just gave them the moment they were already waiting for. I sat quietly, letting the silence fill the room. The machines were still humming softly, the world outside the window moving on like nothing had changed. But inside, something had settled into place. 14 years. 14 years of loyalty. Of showing up early. Staying late. Carrying responsibility without ever asking for recognition. I believed that meant something. I believed it made me safe. But the truth felt different now. They didn't fire me because I called in sick. They fired me because I had become inconvenient. I slowed things down. I asked for time. I refused to rush approvals when something didn't feel right. And the moment I wasn't there to ask those questions anymore, everything moved forward without resistance. My replacement had already been learning my work. The decision had already been made. Calling in sick didn't start the process. It just gave them the perfect excuse to finish it. And now, weeks later, they were still trying to understand why the numbers changed. Still trying to retrace steps I used to track quietly on my own. Because the one person who always paused before signing off was gone the moment she stayed home for a single day. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.